Hi, I'm David King-Lassman, and this is ExploreXR. And today I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Luke DeVore from Unity. And Luke, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, David.
Now, Luke, you've got a pretty interesting past, and I'd love to kick off there. Let our audience know a little bit about your journey and how you got to be where you are, which is a pretty unconventional route to being an executive at Unity, right?
Yeah, it really is. And the truth of the matter is, I'm not a technologist, and I've never really been one. Like in college, for example, I was originally a English literature major, and I had a minor in Spanish until like my junior year. The advisor let me know that my college didn't offer a minor in Spanish, right? So like I was never this like very academic person, never particularly head of the class, and certainly wasn't very technical. I went from English literature to political science. And at that point, I just wanted to go into the Marine Corps. So I just needed to graduate. Yeah, you don't see a whole lot of those backgrounds at Unity right now.
So you ended up in the Marines, is that right?
I did. I got commissioned after I graduated as a second lieutenant.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, it was an interesting time. So there's a couple of ways to enter the Marine Corps as an officer. One is to like go to the Naval Academy. Another is to do an ROTC program, which I didn't do. The Marine Corps has another path that you can go to officer candidate school for a couple of summers during your undergraduate. So the first time that I did that was for a 6-week stint in the summer of 2000. And so I did that and came back, and then a few months later was 9/11. So one of the really interesting things for me was I got some exposure to that OCS, that kind of boot camp in the months before 9/11. And then a year later, the next summer in a post 9/11 world. And I got to just see the massive change in attitude, massive change in urgency, and like the massive change in like, oh crap, this is real, like, stuff's going down. So it was a really, really interesting time. I graduated in 2003, and then I ended up in a year's worth of schools following college. In Marine Corps schools, I was at Quantico, Virginia for 6 months, in a school called the Basic School for all Marine officers, and then I was an artillery officer, so that meant another 6 months at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, learning how to be a Marine artillery officer. So 2004, late 2004 is when I got to the operational forces.
Right. And so how long were you in service then?
A minute, like just less than 5 years.
Right.
I only did one combat deployment,
Right.
2 deployments overall. And I say that, so many of my peers that did a similar amount of time or that served much longer than I did, did 8, 9, 12 combat tours, and then so many more deployments beyond that. So, just for a minute I was there, just enough to get empathy. I always say just enough to empathize with the Marine or with the warfighter, and to kind of think from their perspective about how to interact with products or solutions.
So that's kind of interesting, because if we think about the journey to being in the kind of space that you're in now, if you look back at that time in the military, what do you think were some of the things that you were able to take away from that really helped you in the positions that you've taken subsequent to leaving the forces?
That's a great question. So you want to say like, well, as an officer, like I was a leader. I got to be a leader of Marines at like 23 years old. And that's true, but I was a shitty leader of Marines. Like, let's be honest, like I was 23, like I was super uncomfortable in my own skin. There were so many things that I did poorly that I wish I could have done better, done differently. But I guess at least I had the opportunity, right? I got to learn those lessons pretty early on under some pretty serious contexts about what styles of leadership felt right, and all those many styles and sort of leadership moments that didn't feel right. And I think that really gave me a unique opportunity post Marine Corps to identify like what my leadership style was, and to become much more comfortable with who I am as a leader, and then certainly like who I am not, right? I'm just not the John Wayne, like follow me type that's going to stand up on a hilltop. but that's okay. Also, I had an opportunity to really discover that I love being a part of instruction. I love, putting instruction together, that I just have a knack for helping people understand things and to guide them through the knowledge process, and designing war games. I always love designing war games or tactical decision games. And some of those things ended up being exactly how I got kind of onto the technology side of instructional training.
Right. I'm guessing in the military, I imagine it's much less about egos and more about how we work together to achieve a collective set of goals. And that must be incredible training that you can bring into the workplace.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it should be about that. And there's a lot of egos in the military. So let's be clear. And then you get egos that are backed up by rank, and then that's a really bad combination when they're a jerk, but they also have the rank that you can't tell them that they're a jerk, right? But yeah, absolutely. At the same time, there's really nothing like it. I mean, there probably is somewhere, maybe at really high level athletics, where there's more at stake than just the score of the game. But there's not a lot of opportunity for young people to be put in at such a young age, to be put in such a large peer and non-peer group from so many diverse backgrounds across the country. And then to be forced to go through that whole, forming, storming, norming, and performing paradigm, and very quickly get to the performing side.
Right.
There is probably nothing quite like having experience in the military, especially in a wartime setting.
So let's talk about. And you don't need to go through your whole resume here, but
Yeah.
what happened after you left the military? What kind of opportunities came your way?
Yeah, and it was right as I was leaving. So my last deployment, and I've told this story before, but my last deployment, we were on ships. At any given time, the Marine Corps has these units composed of ships, sailors, and Marines, called a Marine Expeditionary Unit. And at any given time, there's always one in the Mediterranean/Indian Ocean, sort of Atlantic, and there's always one on the west side in the Pacific, always there. And the idea is that this is a force that is able to go anywhere in the world in a matter of hours and respond to a crisis. So if an embassy needs to be evacuated, or if there's some other threat, or if there's a full-blown combat, that MEU is designed to be able to go in there for 30 days and self-sustain itself in combat. So I was on a MEU deployment, and the MEU received a whole suite of these computers. There was this new thing that the Marine Corps was trying out called the Deployable Virtual Training Environment. And I was a weapons company executive officer at the time, and for no particular reason, I was tagged as the guy that was going to figure out these computers and do something with them, because someone up on high said, figure out these computers and do something. The Marine Corps bought them, use them, right? And I really, back to my opening, I was like an English literature guy turned political science major that was by no means like a technologist, but I had some Marines that were. And they kind of knew how to use the network switches and they quickly figured out some of the editor tools. This was using virtual battle space and how to set up and run scenarios. But I was the instructor guy, and I was the Marine officer. So we ended up in an empty berthing space on ship, setting up little missions. And we had an operations center and a planning room. And we were going through and doing these exercises, and it actually worked really, really well. It's my first time being exposed in any significant way to simulation-based training. And it really worked well. And we got to a point that we actually ran like a 48-hour operation, where we would have a unit come in, get their brief, and they would relieve the unit that was already out, and they would do a changeover. And we kept that going with like the operations center and everything for about 48 hours on ship, just using the computers. It was pretty incredible.
So that's kind of interesting, actually, because as you know, most of the people I've talked to on this podcast and most of the people we interface with are in the healthcare space, and simulation, of course, plays an absolutely essential role in helping to drive standards in the way that we, train our doctors and our nurses. They need those simulation hours. I guess that makes sense for that to happen in a military environment as well, so that you're prepared, when, the shit hits the fan, excuse the French.
Yeah, no, I mean, let's look at the order, the phases of an operation as it relates to patient care, right? So like someone comes in and they have to be processed, they have to be admitted, they have to meet certain criteria. And then you're going to have a changeover of the clinical staff, the nurses and the attending and everyone else. And then they have to do their documentation to make sure the oncoming knows what the situation is, and they know to look for certain degradations or changes and what those changes might mean. Same thing in a military operational setting. We went on patrol and this is what we saw and this is what normal looked like. Now here's the things that happened. And then the people that come up after you need to know what happened, where it happened, so they can plan for it. And they can also identify any anomalies or changes and try to make sense out of them and react appropriately. So having that, it's tempting sometimes in simulation, and maybe in all training, to skip the build up entirely and get right to the good parts, where all the action is and like where everything's like just chaos and a decision is coming up. But sometimes it's helpful to do it real time or near real time, and to slow down and to let all of those prerequisite activities serve as context to allow you to have richer and more realistic decision making and processes during your training when things start to get heavy, right? So it's not just sort of like a 30-second sort of, here's what's going on with your standard patient and go. But rather, having all of this build up that serves as your body of knowledge about this patient to try to deliver better outcomes.
Right. So you have this simulation experience in the military, and what happened then?
Then the economy collapsed, right? So this is, I got out right at the beginning of 2008.
Right.
And, the economy was starting to collapse, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself post Marine Corps. But through pure happenstance, I was at the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, and a major called up looking for an old record of his from his time 6 years earlier, when he was at that unit. And I couldn't help him. I had no idea how to help him, but we just started chit-chatting. Turns out that he was a guy who was in Quantico, Virginia, managing that computer-based program at the programmatic level. And he was like, oh, you were on that mute. By any chance, did you interact with this deployable virtual training environment suite? I'm like, yeah, as a matter of fact, like I was the guy, like that was my thing. And he's like, oh, I've heard of you, And then he said, well, if you need a job, we're going to be hiring some additional contractors to support the program. And that was it. Like, 3 months later, I was doing that. So like all things in life, and I say this a lot, like all things in life, it was purely accidental, right?
Right. But this then tweaked an interest in simulation. Then it was computer-based in a room. So when did you start to get interested in what would have been virtual reality, I guess, back then, right?
Yeah, so even back then, so now we're in like 2008, 2009. And even back then, the Marine Corps had invested in a head-worn solution that was made by Lockheed Martin, I think at the time. And it was an actual, relatively early VR headset that could be used for type 1 air controls. So that's a certain type of way to control an aircraft to drop a bomb. But the reason that this was such a big deal was that in order to keep your currency as a forward air controller, the guy who's authorized to control aircraft like that, you had to have so many controls every year in your jacket, in your training jacket. And this one was such a big deal because this head-mounted VR system actually it could count for as many as one of those annual controls. And that's a really big deal, right? So from a logistical and sort of throughput perspective, if the Marine Corps at that time had, I'm going to make this number up, say 2,500 forward air controllers, that means that there were 2,500 fewer annual drops that they needed to do with a real aircraft and a real bomb in a real training area. And there's significant cost savings and time savings and environmental concerns and everything else associated with reducing the number of trials each year by 1. But it also meant that the decision makers had seen the technology and had decided that this very critical skill set can be taught and can be rehearsed in a different way, that we don't have to do it the real way. We don't have to do it live on a training range in order for us to have a warm, fuzzy feeling that the skill is being retained and trained properly.
Yeah. And I know that was a long time ago, but do you recall there being any sort of data points that proved that out? Or was the proof in the pudding the fact that they actually deployed this and used this on a regular basis?
Yeah, so by the time it got to us, the proof was in the pudding. The fact that they had signed off on it was all that we needed to say we're comfortable with it. And anecdotally, I saw a lot of really great things happening. The instructor still mattered. You can't, you couldn't, you had much better outcomes if you had a great instructor that could augment that technology and get a lot more value out of it. But prior to that, though, the Marine Corps, I think in collaboration with the Office of Naval Research, had done a number of studies. They definitely did their due diligence to make sure that technology, that earlier VR headset was affording the right opportunity to train and was, hitting the right notes and not reinforcing bad habits or negative training. So someone else had done all that work to validate it.
Right. And it's also interesting when we think about technological innovation, a lot of it is driven by the military, by government organizations. Yeah. If we look at some of the great programs that are at our disposal today for companies like GigXR, the AFWorks program, the CIVA program, so on, the reason they exist is because the military has to always have the most cutting edge technology to ensure that we achieve the best outcomes.
Absolutely.
And that's, it's a theme right across the military. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting because remember, like in the 80s, like you would watch a movie and someone would have like some high-speed piece of technology, and there was always something military. It was like oh, this is some secret, defense thing that was developed. And it makes sense because back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there was an amazing amount of progress made by the Department of Defense, agencies like DARPA that were developing, GPS and lasers and all sorts of microwaves and all sorts of things that became commercially available and the leading technologies. But I think that changed a little bit in the late 80s and the 90s, right? With the advent of the internet and everything that came with it. I think the DoD was playing catch up. Even recently, I saw an article that one of the services, and I don't want to get it wrong, so I won't say which one. Mm-hmm. But one of the services, I think it was the Army, just announced that they're going to authorize a bring your own device approach for training and stuff. So in other words, if you have an iPhone, if you have an iOS operating system, you can now use your own device to receive like digital training. David, that's not very like, so what, right? Like, yeah, and instead of them actually like issuing every single soldier either an Android device or an iPhone or some other thing, they said like you can just use your own. Like that's 10, 15-year-old concepts at this point. So at a certain point, I think the Defense Department started to lag a little bit, and a lot of the innovations were occurring on the commercial side, Silicon Valley leading the way. Maybe except in the XR space, because all the while the DoD had been exploring XR. They never really stopped. Whereas I think in the commercial side, there was a few fits and spurts, but it wasn't being taken as seriously because monetization was unclear for XR for a long time, I think. So I think maybe in the mid-aughts to around 2010 is when the DoD really started to pull far ahead in the XR space, in my opinion. And then the commercial side started to recognize that there might be something there. Right around the time of the Oculus acquisition by Facebook. And then things really started to accelerate. Google Glass was certainly a part of it, but it didn't really push the needle. But it did say to the rest of us that, although it wasn't an awesome example, the technology is developing. And before you know it, we had what I think to be one of the main game changers, which was the HoloLens, and then the Magic Leap around the same time.
Yeah. So I don't want to harp too much on about the military, but it is interesting that you say that they were, very motivated by XR. Do you think that was because they saw XR as being able to achieve outcomes that they couldn't use or couldn't use so effectively in other media, or do you think they saw it as an OpEx saving?
Savings, I think. I think the ultimate driver was savings and efficiencies, because the military has the resources to do some pretty incredible things. I saw, and I participated in training where we had entire abandoned bases that they recreated as villages with thousands of role players and with Hollywood effects of explosions, and then you'll come up to a casualty and be an actual amputee who they added a moulage kit to look like that bomb that just went off took off his legs, and the guy's screaming in pain, and there's gunshots. I mean, if they want to, the military has the resource to be able to do some things that are absolutely incredible in terms of training, but it's expensive. It's difficult to scale. When for a little while there, the military was getting enormous amounts of funding in support of the global war on terror. But inevitably that started to wane, and the writing was on the wall that they're going to have to find efficiencies. And I think that's where the real push for XR adoption came in.
Right, that's really interesting. Okay, so let's jump forward, Luke, to this year, and you're at Unity, right?
I am, yeah, which is super exciting.
So tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, what's your role? What's your title?
Yeah.
And then, why you? What did they see in you, Luke, that they thought this is the guy for us?
Sure. So I'm the senior manager for strategy and partnerships, specifically in our aerospace and government division. So a little while ago, not that long ago, maybe 24 months ago, Unity realized how many of their licenses were held by companies or research organizations that were in the DoD or the federal market space. And I think it was a bit of a surprise to them. Now, as someone who goes to ITSEC every year, or someone that's been a part of the community, I could have told them that. And I didn't know that they didn't know. And they didn't know that they didn't know. It was sort of this eureka moment, like, wow, like there's a lot of people using our stuff in the DoD market. And at the same time, the company does an amazing job on the gaming space, on commercial gaming, AAA gaming, mobile gaming, monetization of gaming, and everything else. But they also recognize that there is a very real and very awesome opportunity on the industrial side, on the non-gaming side, and how real-time 3D can or will be used to support the digital twin and digital modernization, the digital thread, how product lifecycle management and architecture, engineering, construction, how design and prototype development for boats and cars and everything in between is going to be affected by real-time 3D, and they're very interested in that. I mean, it's such a fascinating space, and I think that the military and the government offer an amazing opportunity to prove that market and to be involved in some large and important projects where we can demonstrate the value of real-time 3D for those things, for those industrial use cases.
Okay, let me come back to that in a second. But Unity is a really interesting company. I describe it as one of those companies that, one of the biggest companies in the world that people don't necessarily know about, right? Your average gamer or kid sitting at home with a headset on just plays these awesome games, and they don't know that, huge majority of them are driven by the Unity platform. Just how big is Unity? Do you have, can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think our headcount is around 5,000 right now. Margin of error in there.
Yeah.
And you're right too. I was at GameStop buying a Switch game for my kids, and I was wearing my Unity shirt, and we're talking about the game and this and that, and then I was half expecting like the person at GameStop to be like, oh, I know Unity, but like, no recognition there at all. They had no idea that how many of the games that they talk about every day are made with Unity. But I think Unity is at about 5,000 people, and then and growing, right? Our whole, one of the things that I didn't know is that we have an enormous Accelerate Solutions division. So we have this very large bench of technical artists and developers and engineers and other folks who are available to help other organizations do custom products. So absolutely, we sell software, we create software products and everything else, but we're also doing an enormous amount of custom solutions work right now, both for the commercial markets and for the government.
Right. So Unity, we know, has driven the gaming market. It's been synonymous with gaming. You've been brought in to run almost like an enterprise component within Unity. How important is that side of the business to Unity, do you think, to establish a footprint outside of gaming?
Well, I mean, you put your money where your mouth is. They're certainly investing in it. We have, I think so Orlando, Florida is still a bit of the the epicenter for DoD and federal real-time 3D technologies. And I think we now have 25 people or so that we've hired, most of which in the last 12 to 18 months, that are there in Central Florida, including an office that we just opened in downtown Orlando. And also during our earnings report, I think it was probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, our CFO, could have mentioned any number of the successes that we had that quarter. But the one that he called out was a recent win that we received with our partners at CACI, supporting a DARPA effort, conducting next generation multimodal human systems interfaces with the help of Unity. It was actually at the time, and I think it probably still is, it was only about a month and a half ago, one of our largest digital twin wins. And that's the one that they decided to talk about to our shareholders. So I think they are extremely excited about what this team is doing, the government and aerospace team, and what it means to the future of the industrial side of real-time 3D at Unity.
Yeah, we know from our own experience of talking to some of the folks at Unity, they're interested in telling our story at GigXR because we're a very good use case for Unity, right? We're doing something of value in the healthcare space. So Unity has driven so much of the VR experience. Let's think a little bit about the distinction between VR and MR. What do you think, Luke, when you look at MR, where do you think its value lies today, and how do you think that's going to shift over the course of time?
Yeah, so I think where we need to get to is solving problems. And maybe that's the most obvious thing I'll say today. But for a long time, having a cool demonstration of a VR or an AR technology was in and of itself good enough, right? And it kind of proved your technology chops. But a lot of folks, which is great news, by the way. I mean, there are so many people out there that are capable Unity developers and they're doing really neat things in AR, VR, et cetera. But we're at the point now that we actually having to start proving the value, the operational value. We have to start proving the value from the perspective of that, chief financial officer, or from that program manager, or the people that actually have to deliver results to their customers. And we have to start thinking about how is real-time 3D going to create real value, and how are we going to start creating things that people don't use just when the important guy comes for a VIP visit, but rather they use every single day because it allows them to be better at their job, or allows them to be more prepared to execute their job. So as we think about VR and AR or MR or some reality in between, I think it's all about value and what your outcomes are. Again, that's probably pretty obvious, but I think sometimes we get so sucked into the art of the possible that we stop thinking about what actually adds value and the business cases, the true business cases behind them. So in the industrial applications, I think mixed reality makes a ton of sense. In industrial applications, I think you need to be able to see the people and the environment around you. Context matters for safety reasons, but also because you're looking at lots of physical things, but having access to that additional information, being able to receive those things at the point of need that otherwise you would have to remove yourself from context in order to engage with. You'd have to open up your computer, or you would have to go onto your tablet, and you would have to do the orientation from the schematic you're looking at to the part of the building you're looking at. All of those cognitive processes are redundant at this point. You don't need to do it that way. So I think mixed reality and having the ability to blend those things, to blend the digital world with the physical world, to allow us to make better decisions, to get to root causes of failure faster, that adds real value. To be able to track supply chains and logistics, to be able to identify and predict failures and everything else, that adds value. That's the type of thing that you can put a dollar sign ahead of it, and you can decide if you're going to continue to invest in that technology, or if you're going to do something different. But there's other types of value too, right? On the VR side, how valuable is Bedside Manor? How valuable is being able to deal with a really difficult family member? And any clinician will tell you that the patients are hard, but the family members are the hardest part about being a clinician, is having to, right? But how valuable is that? How valuable is that to the quality of patient outcomes, or to the institution's reputation, that they're fantastic at empathy and they're fantastic at de-escalation? How valuable is it when you're looking for Affordable Care Act reimbursements to know that you're really, really well trained at giving post-discharge instructions for wound care and things like that? The type of things that typically lead to readmissions and then lower your reimbursement rates under the Affordable Care Act. I think you can draw that CFO can draw a clear line to VR experiences as a way to avoid cost or to add value as well. But all of it comes back to that thing that you actually need to obtain, the very tangible business case for your experience, for your reality.
I'm going to put you on the spot here, and maybe this is unfair, but over the course of your experiences with extended reality, can you point to one of your favorite use cases where you said, where it's like, that's it, that's a great example of value being driven through this medium?
Yeah, there's a couple. One was more early career. I was getting my master's, and one of the things I've always been very interested in, well, I got interested in it and I've been interested since, is knowledge management. The hardest thing in the world, whether you're a small organization with 30 people or if you have 30,000 people, how do you codify and make available and organize and really leverage all of that knowledge that we gain, right? How many times have you interacted with someone and then you're having casual conversation with a colleague and like, oh, I know that person. Yeah, I actually know this about them and this and this. And then you say, oh, I wish I would have known that. That would have been so helpful. So back when I was supporting one of the training simulation programs for the Marine Corps, I was very interested in knowledge management as related to enemy tactics, techniques, and procedures that were being used in Afghanistan and Iraq. So at this point, we had nearly 10 years of combat operations in multiple theaters of warfare. And I felt like we weren't doing a good job of soliciting those stories and that information from the lower level, tactical level troops, Marines, and providing other Marines an opportunity to learn from those experiences. Aside from getting together at the bar with the guy and having a drink, there just wasn't a lot of that storytelling, that sort of purposeful storytelling going on. So we created there at the Simulation Center at Camp Lejeune something that I call tactical virtual guided discussions. Basically, we would take lessons or stories that we got directly from Marines, and we recreate entire simulation scenarios around those stories. But one of the things that I liked that we did was that we recognized the limitations of the simulation itself. We created these really difficult tactical dilemmas in simulation, but we never expected the Marines to fight their way out of those situations because they would get frustrated. If you held them to the standard of how they would perform in real life, they would get frustrated because they're uncomfortable with the controls, or peripheral vision is different and I couldn't see that the guy was there, or there's 1,000 things that are different in the sim than it was in real life. So don't hold them to a real life standard. So what we did instead was we introduced them to the scenario and we had them experience that event, and they just basically did their best. But we weren't after them to perform, we were after them to empathize, to have an understanding for the complexity of the event, to have an understanding for how the volume of fire or the terrain or the man-made structures or the use of an IED or the use of smoke, how all of these things contributed to the event. And then it was called a tactical virtual guided discussion, because instead of focusing on like, oh, you screwed up here and you screwed up there in the debrief, what we focused on was a guided discussion where we brought all these elements, to the foreground and discussed why they occurred, what we could have done better, why did the enemy try to do that. And the cool thing about it too was that we would have things that we intended for the Marines to learn, but almost all the time there were 3 times as many unintended learning points that would emerge. Things that we didn't design into this scenario on purpose, but they sort of came to light and they provided an awesome springboard. So I like that example because it was knowledge management. It was about getting peer knowledge from one group to another peer group. And I also like that example because I thought we did a really good job of recognizing what the sim did well, which was affording an opportunity to experience something that you couldn't otherwise experience. But we also recognize what the sim didn't do well, which is give the Marines an opportunity to actually perform in a combat environment as they would in real life. And that's why I think it works so well.
Yeah, that's a great story. And of course, that was back then. If we think about the advancements in the quality of the kind of holograms and content that we can produce, I mean, you can create environments that are very difficult to discern reality from non-reality, right? Absolutely. And if we look at also, you talk about those sort of soft skill learning, dealing with people in these scenarios. If we look at, Unreal's MetaHuman product, which is a phenomenal product. I know that Unity recently, you acquired Ziva Dynamics, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we can guess that you're going to kind of go down that route, which is, by the way, wonderful news, because that opens up so many doors of opportunity, doesn't it? If we can actually create these hyper realistic, real looking people that can react in real time. I mean, imagination runs wild with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In adult learning, one of the main principles is that the learning has to be perceived as relevant to the learner. Adults don't want to be treated like children. And I've had a problem for a long time with the quality of humans and human interaction in simulation. And then some of the projects that we've done have been like healthcare related or tactical combat casualty care and things like that. And if you're looking for a procedural trainer, fantastic. If you're looking for something to make sure that you're conducting good quality combat handoff, basically doing the documentation so that the corpsman behind you, knows what's going on with this patient. And then when they upload him onto the aircraft, they know what's, great. But if you're trying to train a guy to keep turning that tourniquet, even though the guy is screaming in pain because it hurts when you turn the tourniquet, if you're trying to get him to be less, to be more comfortable with hearing those screams and seeing the pain on the patient's face, but knowing that it's the right thing to do because we have to stop the bleeding, that's the most important thing. You really can't do that super well, or you haven't been able to do it super well given the state of the art. Those avatars just don't emote. It's not even uncanny valley. It's well on the other side. And some of the things that we're seeing recently, though, so I think the MetaHuman is a great example, and then I can think of some others, right? Like the stuff there, Metastage, and the stuff that's being done with GigXR, where it is a real human. It's a real human, and in a lot of cases, these are professional actors that really know how to, elicit strong emotion, and it makes a big difference.
Yeah,
it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking to a great doctor at one of our partner institutions who was saying that when you thrust a student into a simulation environment where they're confronted by an inanimate mannequin, suddenly the stakes are low. And when the stakes are low, there's no urgency, and it doesn't prepare you. And you said it, empathy it's a very difficult thing to train, easier to train when you can take simulation to the next level, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I was an artillery officer. So we would pull lanyards, or our Marines would pull lanyards. And then at that point, a 99-pound shell would go rocketing down range, 7, 8, 15 miles. Once it leaves, it's gone. There's no hitting the cancel button. There's no like, oh no, wrong coordinates, bring it back. Once it's gone, it's gone. So we always say that, in live training as artillerymen in particular, there's that pucker factor, like that, that there are stakes here. It's important to be precise. It's important to get things right. It's important to follow procedure. And if you're not using live rounds, so to speak, or if you're not working and actually hurting, or trying to save the life of a real human, then what can you do to give that trainee, to build that context and that emotional response to make them a little bit closer to feeling that way?
Yeah, that's amazing. So let's talk a little bit now about, I know we touched on this about where we're going to go, but if you let your imagination run wild, Luke, what do you think is going to happen with XR in particular, maybe through Unity, but just in the market in general, where are we going? How far can we go with this technology?
Yeah. We're going all the way, I think, right? I think it's unstoppable at this point. So I started to say that the headsets were going to get smaller, and then they would get fashionable, and then they would get micro, and then they would become invisible. And I think we're in the fashionable phase now. Some of them are more fashionable than others, but you've seen some now that almost look like a pair of like Ray-Bans.
Yeah.
And they're maybe not spatial, they're like information overlay, but you see people increasingly trying to get to the point of creating headsets that you could use daily during normal activity, that aren't only reserved for laboratories and training rooms. Eventually though, and Dr. Kelly Hale, someone that I used to work with, had this wonderful human factors sort of like long view perspective speech that she used to give. And I think I agree with her completely, that it'll become invisible, it'll become implantable. And I think we all need to, so what does that all mean for like privacy? And there are 1,000 implications for how we live and how comfortable we are with data being shared. But everything's going to be connected, So for me, the metaverse, and people talk about the metaverse and what that means. For me, I think it's just persistent digital information everywhere. And it won't be because there's a Viforio marker on my lamp. It's because the computer vision is going to recognize that lamp. And it's going to immediately know who manufactured that lamp. It's going to immediately know if I need to get another one, where I can find it. It's going to immediately know how long I've had my lamp, and recommend other lamps from the series. People who bought this lamp in 2008 tend to buy this lamp in 2023. And it's going to be everywhere, everything we do. It's going to be human augmentation, right? Of how we make decisions, of how we relate to other people, of how we navigate in our world. I don't know when that's going to be, David. I don't know if that's like the 15-year or the 30-year, but I think inevitably that's where it's going. We're already doing that now. We're already asking our phone to do a lot of that for us. And I think a lot of us are frustrated because our phone doesn't do more. How many questions do we have throughout the day that go unanswered because we're just not in a position to bust out our phone and ask it? I think we're going to continue to remove the barriers between humans and information.
That's interesting. And you touched on the metaverse there. I know that Mark Zuckerberg and his crew are trying to own that space. And I don't necessarily subscribe to his vision of the metaverse. I'm guessing you don't. I love what you're saying here about this ultimate coming together of the physical digital worlds, where they're almost indistinguishable, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And I think that's extraordinary, then, the potential of where we can take this. So, obviously we're very focused on healthcare. You know a lot about the military. Which other verticals do you think are going to become beneficiaries of extended reality in the short to medium term?
So Unity has a big focus on architecture, engineering, construction, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So think about all the tradesmen that are involved in building a commercial space, and the importance, again, back to the business case, back to either making money or saving money, how important it is to make sure that the electricians, the carpenters, the drywall guys, and the flooring guy, and everyone in between are all working off the same exact understanding of the to be built and the is built, and to avoid having to go back in and move electrical outlets because something that was on a schematic wasn't communicated well to the laborer that's actually putting stuff in. So, in the future, all of the laborers themselves will have immediate access, shared access to the same schematics. They'll be able to interact with them. So the drywall guy can be pointing to the electrician and he says like, hey, I see we have 4 outlets going here now and not just 3, and the electrician will look over there and say, yeah, there's 4 there now. Yeah. So it doesn't matter what version of the schematic they're working off of. But it's not just the laborers, so go up a couple, right? The inspector, and how he's going to have access to information. And then to the project manager, and to the salespeople that are selling those retail spaces or those residential spaces above the retail spaces, and how they're going to interact with digital twins of the apartment buildings.
Yeah.
I mean, everything in between. But yeah. So I think the retail, or I'm sorry, real estate, architecture, engineering, and then product lifecycle management, and how we can currently build prototypes. Unity has this wonderful digital twin maturation model that I like very much, and it talks about how that initial sort of 3D real-time 3D model, which by the way you can do right now like 3D CAD, so it's not that different, but that the Unity version of it is the virtualization model, but then you add data, real-time data to it, and you connect it, and then you have the third stage at that point, and then you can start to virtualize things, and you can start to use that model as the thing that you plug into simulation, that you train on, that you conduct, lockout, tagout procedures on. And then you take it up a step, and now it's the model that you use to do all your predictive stuff. Mean time to failure, or I want to add a new feature, but it weighs this much and it's going to suck out this much from the battery. Now you can start to do all those analytic things. And then you go a step further, and that same model becomes the model that you can use to train autonomous behaviors and machine learning agents. So the digital twin itself becomes this, it's not a terminal event that extinguishes with the visualization of the thing. It grows, and it supports the entire product lifecycle management from initial prototyping all the way through to future automation and computer vision type stuff. It's a wonderful thing. And again, you can point to dollar signs at every step of those models, and how it's going to accelerate the creation of revenue, or how it's going to accelerate profit margins, or just how it's going to decrease costs and schedule.
So I'm conscious that we're running a little long here, so I'm thinking about winding this down. But I think what's really interesting about hearing you talk about this, I know that in the community at large, there are people who are still, not necessarily naysayers, but looking to get those validation points, particularly, and it has to be said, in the investment community. And yet I listen to you, and you seem so certain in the impact that extended reality is going to have on every aspect of the world we live in. It's great to hear. Is there any sort of last words that you want to leave us with about XR, about the journey we're on, about the fact that we are trailblazing? It's still a very nascent technology in the scheme of things.
No, you kind of said it yourself, and I've been on some Metaverse panels and whatnot. And my recommendation to everyone is really that we recognize how important it is to go from the fanciful demonstration to the value-added application. Because there's so much talk about the Metaverse that we are at risk of losing people's attention. We're at risk of losing the VC community's attention. We're at risk of Facebook's shareholders finally getting fed up with the $10 billion a year they're spending on the Metaverse. So I encourage everyone that's involved in it, especially like those small shops, and there's so many amazing smaller players that are doing cool things, but I encourage everyone to really start focusing on solving business problems, and really finding the value, the operational value in those projects that they're taking on. In short, as far as I can see it, I'm a huge fan in the XR space, specifically mixed reality and augmented reality. And I think more than anything, we have to focus on solutions that are simple. We have to focus, right? Like, it can't be overly complex or arduous. We have to be comfortable enough integrating it into our daily, either personal lives or professional lives. It has to be smart. There has to be data that comes in and data that goes out. It can't live on an island. It has to interact with the world around it. And then third, and probably most important, it has to be useful. It has to actually do meaningful things that make your work life or your personal life better and more productive. So simple, smart, useful. That's my formula.
Okay. Well, Luke, thank you so much for joining me on the show. And thank you, not just for your service, by the way, but also for the incredible enthusiasm that you have for this space. The industry needs a lot more people like you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm really grateful. And I look forward to working with you and with Unity down the line and doing incredible things.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
All right. I'm David King-Lassman. This is ExploreXR. Thank you so much.